One of the, I think, a major thing, a major theme in the book is this difference that we mentioned at the beginning, the effective truth and the formal truth, the way things appear and the way things actually work.
Yeah.
That things are often not what they appear. And I wonder if, I guess the question is, if I think of the average person who sort of is just watching current events on the world stage. You see, the president of the United States. You see Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia. You see Xi Jinping, or this, that, and the other leader, this, that, and the other organization. There's a lot of, obvious loci of power where you think all of it's concentrated. But given the theme that things are not always what they seem, and that we're often being misled and misdirected, and power can be hiding in places and often is camouflaged in ways that allow us to miss it. When based on your research and your knowledge of this area, when you sort of look at the world stage, are there any individuals or organizations you see as being enormously powerful that perhaps the average person wouldn't think of that way?
Well, she's no longer in power, but I often thought of Angela Merkel as being a very, very astute player of the game. She had her limitations and she made mistakes. And in retrospect, I would maybe bring her down a notch or two in some things. But when I looked at her, how she projected, she was basically the dominant force on the European continent for an incredibly long period of time. This woman who was not charismatic at all, was a scientist, essentially a chemist, right? And was not a necessarily good speaker or anything. She was kind of bland. She totally dominated the scene. And one thing I say in the 48 Laws is often the people who appear to be the most powerful, who appear to be the most charismatic, aren't the ones that really have the power. It's the dull ones. It's the ones who aren't necessarily getting the headlines, who really control the strings, or they're like the puppet master, right? And so she kind of impressed me that way as somebody who was a consummate player of the game. She was very calm. She always understood the real interests involved in her for her country and what really mattered. And she was very, very, very strategic in her maneuvers. I remember. So she had a way of thinking that that's what I glom onto. So there was a famous meeting between her and Putin because she was not friends with him, but she kind of understood him and was trying to work with him for various reasons. And Putin, in this meeting, very cleverly brought his dog there, knowing that Angela Merkel had a tremendous fear of dogs, right? And this would upset her and put her on the defensive. And in this particular meeting, he would get her all emotional, right? And the moment he brought the dog in, she recognized the ploy. She recognized what he was up to. And she stayed calm and she didn't let it happen. But that awareness of, oh, maybe, he just brought a dog. He had no idea, it's just a mistake. And then you get all fearful, etc. No, I know this man. I know how fucking clever he is. I know he's always thinking a move ahead. He's always trying to put you on the defensive. He is deliberately bringing that dog in to upset me. That's brilliant. Another time she's in a meeting with the French president at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, who's this one of the typical short men, Napoleonic complex. Macron is a bit like that right now, who thinks he's so powerful and in control, etc. And he projects that, and he's trying to intimidate her. And he's in the meeting, and his legs are crossed, and his foot keeps nervously going like this. And she realizes this guy is shivering. He's nervous. His face projects all of this power, but deep inside, he's actually kind of frightened and timid. So that ability to read people, to kind of step back, that is a rare skill. When I read about anybody in the news now, I'm constantly analyzing them through that lens. And she's the one that stands out as someone who's very good at the game. Most people have limitations. And that's an idea that Machiavelli has that I think is one of his most brilliant ideas of all. I continually come back to it. It's in The Prince. And the idea is people will often rise to a position of power in any area based on one quality that they have, whether it's aggression, whether it's being a total social charmer, whether it's being good at whether they're charismatic. And then they reach a level where that that one strength is no longer effective because circumstances change, and someone who's aggressive suddenly has to become someone who's flexible, and they can't adapt, and they're crushed, right? So most of these people that I see have a flaw, have something that they're not so good at. So Boris Johnson in the UK, he's very clever. He comes from a background in journalism. He's very good with marketing and publicity. He knows how to be kind of a clown and make people laugh. He has self-deprecating humor. But he's also got a blind spot in his personal relationships. He hires bad people who are going to embarrass him, etc. So most people in positions of power, and I do a lot of consulting people in these different areas, have like an Achilles heel that is generally their downfall. And so there are very few people you can point to and say they're kind of a well-rounded leader. They know how to be aggressive when it's necessary. They know how to be soft. They know how to do what Napoleon said and to put your iron fist inside of a velvet glove so that people feel the soft velvetness of your touch, but inside is like this piece of iron that's firm, etc. Most people aren't good at that. And so it's a rare figure on the stage that would be.
Interesting. What about the opposite? What about, offices or institutions or individuals that are popularly perceived to wield a lot of power, but maybe in fact do not?
Yes, there are many examples of that. I think we often look at the figureheads because we're appearance-based. So when George W. Bush was president, I think it became quite clear that he really wasn't the person that was controlling everything. It was the Cheneys and the people behind the scene that were kind of pulling the strings, right? And oftentimes in business, I was on the board of directors of a publicly traded company for many years. Often in business, the CEO isn't really the person that's controlling things, although they're the public face, they're the one that's getting all of the attention. It's really the figures behind the scene, the board members, the chief financial officer, et cetera, et cetera. There's a notion in sociology that even the person on the top is just as dependent on the people below as people below are on the person on top, that it kind of flows in both directions. I forget what the word of that is. But so you look at somebody like a Putin, who clearly has all the power in Russia, but his power depends on these people who are known as the Silovikis, the men of force, who are not the oligarchs, but the people in government who kind of control all the intelligence agencies, the defense, the military, etc. He dominates them. He controls them in various ways. I've looked at how he does that. It's very powerful. He makes them dependent on him, but he is equally dependent on them, and they pull the strings. So if they wanted to get rid of him tomorrow, they could do that. So the game goes both directions as well. You have to see power as this kind of continuous game of flux, and the appearances are deceptive. And the person who seems to control everything is not necessarily the person who does, that it shifts day by day. There are balances that the person who controls actually has to depend on other people who kind of have other degrees of influence, etc. So it's a fluid game that's continually changing. And, there are plenty of examples, particularly in history, of rulers who we think were very powerful, but in the end were just kind of great figureheads. And it was others behind the scenes who really controlled it. Even Louis XIV, prior to that, it was Cardinal Richelieu. But then after, for Louis XIV, Cardinal Mazarin and other ministers were the ones that were really wielding the power in France at the time. So it's the quintessential man or woman behind the throne who's really the one in power. So that's where you need to analyze it through that lens of Machiavelli, the effective truth. Who effectively really controls it? Who, if they decided to withdraw their approval of the leader, would destroy him? Look at the levers of power and analyze it as brutally as you would a scientific formula, because that's how power can be.
Mm-hmm. And we mentioned earlier, one last current thing I'd like to ask you about before we wind down is, did you see the recent news that Elon Musk bought quite a substantial stake in Twitter?
Yes, I did.
What do you make of that move, and what might be going on there?
Well, I haven't really studied in depth. There was an article in the paper today, and I didn't have a chance to read it. But it's clearly a power move. Clearly, there are things about Twitter that he doesn't like and that he's bumped up against. And so he's bought a 9% share in it, which is going to give him a degree of influence and control over it. And he's somebody who has a kind of a libertarian ideology, both politically and otherwise, where he believes that there should be complete freedom of expression. He has an idea that the internet should be this area where ideas just flow back and forth. There shouldn't be any kind of filtering going on. Everything should be direct. And so he wants to have the power to kind of bring this to Twitter. And the little that I read, it made out as if he had already discussed this with the CEO of Twitter and that they had approved it. But my little Machiavellian brain goes, I don't think so. I don't believe that they're quite so happy about this as he makes out. He's branding this as if he's going to revive Twitter. He's going to bring it back to its roots. And maybe he's right about that. But there's a law of power that's extremely important, which is preach the need for change, but never reform. Preach the need for reform, but never change too much. So people are essentially conservative. They like the idea of reform. They like the idea of change, but we don't like our habits being broken up. We think we know how to do things best. And if somebody comes in saying, we're going to change all of that, we're going to have you do something different. And I see this time and again in the newspaper and history where the reformer is somebody who ends up being ousted because nobody can stand that much change. I have a feeling that the CEO is not so comfortable with this move as they're playing out. Of course, he has to admit, yes, I think Elon Musk on the board is a fantastic thing, because what else is he going to say? But I think they're kind of quaking in their boots that change could be coming. And I don't know if so totally untethering and giving complete free speech is necessarily going to be a good thing for Twitter. But Elon Musk is definitely somebody who has an agenda, and buying a position on the board is a quintessential power move. It's not a move where he wants to just be an advisor. He wants to be able to control and change the direction of Twitter.